It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Well, good morning. Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George Live Line. We're back on the air live this morning. We, not that long ago, talked to our good friend, Captain John Cox. He's always willing to come on and talk aviation safety. That is his life. And there's been a couple of things happened since then already that I wanted to get him back on here. And he was agreeable enough to come on. So got to thank him for that. And for folks that may not know or might just need a little reminder, Captain John Cox is a veteran major airline, corporate, and general aviation pilot. He's flown over 14,000 hours with over 10,000 in command of jet airliners. Additionally, he's flown as an instructor, a check pilot, and test pilot, in addition to his extensive involvement in global air safety. He authors the Ask the Captain column for the USA Today. That's every week, I think. He serves as the aviation analyst for NBC News and provides expertise in numerous other media outlets. He also frequently appears as an expert on the television programs Air Disasters and Why Planes Crash. You'll see those a lot of times on the Weather Channel in the particular. Now, his day job is Chief Executive Officer of Safety Operating Systems in Washington, D.C. And as the founder of SOS, Captain Cox has led the growth from a startup into a major consulting success. His clients now include international and domestic airlines, government regulators, manufacturers, business, and corporate flight departments, and other consulting firms. It's a busy morning for him, so I want to get right to him and welcome him on in and get to this most recent story down there in Houston that we wanted to talk about. So let's say good morning to Captain John Cox.
Good morning, George. Hope you're doing well.
We're doing great back here, and there's some people down in the Houston area, I think, that are happy to be doing great, and I'm happy to report on it. But, I mean, this thing was kind of a miracle in my mind. It was definitely hair-raising. Let me bring this up on screen to get us started here and get to this article. And this is actually the one that I grabbed is out of CNN. You can see this photo here. That's the remnants of this plane, and they're still putting some of the flames out. Get out, get out. People on a Houston plane were told as it crashed, a passenger says. One of the 21 people on board a plane that crashed in Houston Tuesday was looking forward to the trip of a lifetime, the passenger told CNN affiliate KHOU. But the plane carrying Houston Astros fans to their team's game against the Red Sox up in Boston never gained altitude at takeoff and crashed into a fence before bursting into flames, going down the runway. And it just all of a sudden they slammed on the brakes, it seemed like, the passenger said. He didn't want to be named, telling KHOU. They were flying around, and when it finally came to a stop, they just said, "Get out, get out." Because we thought it was going to explode. Things were flying around, the man said. It was already on fire before we got out of it. Now, the point that I was getting to down here, miraculously, there were no major injuries among the crew and passengers. The emergency slides deployed and passengers were able to slide down to safety. The investigation into the crash could take between 12 and 18 months, said Michael Graham, board member with the National Transportation Safety Board. Okay, let's bring the captain back in here because I got a couple of questions here. And one of the things that's great because of your knowledge and experience, Captain, this is an aircraft, again, that I would suspect you're well familiar with.
Oh, yeah, the MD-80s series, this is an MD-87, but it's one of several, has been in service since the 70s. It's a veteran airplane. It's a well-proven, good design. It's getting a little older now. It's not quite as fuel efficient as some of the newer ones, but this airplane is a well-proven airplane.
Let me bring go back to the screen here because I've got a shot here of what this thing looks like, and I think it may even look familiar to some of our viewers. And I got this off of the website btj.com, I think it is. Yeah, btjonline.com. The Boeing MD87 that the captain's talking about. Now, I was kind of surprised when I looked at this, Captain, because I didn't know what we were talking about here. I was thinking, okay, people going to a ball game this is a private jet, probably something like a Learjet or something similar. Man, this is a commercial aircraft, is what I would think, that's been converted to private use, and that's kind of what's happened to this particular plane, right?
Yeah, this is likely was an airliner at one time, and it's been converted. Excuse me, it's been converted into a corporate airplane, and so I was a little surprised when I heard that it was an MD87. There are not that many of them flying in corporate use, so this was a bit of a rare airplane.
Well, that article that I had up there, the reason that it was written actually was it was kind of almost encouraging people to look at these planes for private use, for corporate. They said, for a cool $5 million, which in today's world with some people is completely affordable, you can have an aircraft like this. My question is, when it comes to flying this, as opposed to, I've been on a King Air with, a few people and that type of thing. I mean, do you need more expertise, more talent and ability, behind the wheel, so to speak, to fly an aircraft like this than you do what we normally think of when it comes to corporate aircraft?
There's a lot of corporate pilots that are extremely highly qualified professionals that could transition into this sort of airplane without any problem at all. Any airline pilot would be able to transition into it. Flying large airplanes, whether they're the larger corporate airplanes or airliners, is very similar in the required training. So moving from a light twin to this airplane would be a pretty good step. But moving from a corporate jet to this airplane would be a matter of just going to school for the about 6 weeks that it takes to get type rated and qualified.
Okay, so this thing is rolling down a runway at I think it's a private airport. You probably know where it was at, around the Houston area. What are some of the common reasons that you can think of that a plane like this wouldn't be able to take off? What could have happened?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the testimony that we've gotten from the passengers that they initiated takeoff roll and then rejected the takeoff. And this is a maneuver that pilots train for. What the big question is there calculations done, performance calculations done prior to each takeoff to ensure that the weight, the speed, and all meet the limitations of the runway and the climb requirements. So now the question is, when they rejected the takeoff, why did they overrun the runway? And that's going to be the focus, I think, of the NTSB investigators. The good news, I read this morning that they have recovered both the digital flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, and they're en route to Washington to be read out. So we'll know what happened, but this sounds very much like a rejected takeoff that didn't go as planned. And it was also of interest to me, the length that it overran the runway. Typically, a rejected takeoff that overruns doesn't go very far. I've read this one went between 300 and 500 meters. That's a fairly long ways. That means that when the airplane left the runway surface, it was still moving at a pretty good speed. But those are where I think the investigators are going to look.
I got a question for you on those flight recorders. Like you mentioned, they're going to be recovered. Do they have everything you need? Has there ever been an unsolved crash when those recorders are recovered? I guess that's number one. And then number two, is a private operator of a plane like this required to maintain and keep those recorders up to date, just like a commercial airliner would have to?
On the first question, yes, in days past. The United accident in March of 1991, United 585 in Colorado Springs, although it had a relatively rudimentary recording system, they initially did not determine the cause of that. And until during the investigation of US Air 427, which crashed in September of 1994, they were able to tie those two accidents together, partially based on the flight data recorder from the US Air airplane, to solve both of them. So there are a few cases where NTSB has said we really just don't know what happened, but they're pretty rare. To your second question, For large airplanes, which large airplanes are defined as anything weighing more than 12,500 pounds, they are required to have flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders that are operative. This is particularly true for turbine-powered or jet-powered airplanes.
Okay, the next question that I have, I'm actually going to go not back to the videotape, but back to the web here. I wanted to bring this article up on screen. I talked about the fact that you author Ask the Captain in USA Today, and I found this from several years ago. The question was, Ask the Captain, how do pilots decide when to take off? Now, this is, second nature to you, obviously, but to a lot of people, they don't really know what this stuff means. The question is, what are V1 and V2? So I guess start there. Tell us what that is, because you'll hear these things V1 on cockpit recorders. Everybody's seen this on the shows that you've been a part of, and then there will be that command by the captain to rotate, or whoever's flying the plane, the second in command, whatever. But V1, V2, and rotate. Explain those.
Sure. V1 is the speed at which you are committed to fly. Up to V1, if you need to stop the airplane, there's sufficient runway to do it. And so you calculate these V speeds before every takeoff, and it's based on the weight of the airplane, the temperature, the runway slope, altitude of the runway. So, but V1 is your commit to fly speed. I apologize for the phone.
Oh, that's okay. You can even get it if you want to. It's okay.
No, that's okay. It's the commit to fly speed. Even if you lose an engine, it is the point at which you're still going to fly and come back around and land at the airport. So it's a very critical speed, and you announce that. Both pilots announce V1, and at that point, the captain will physically take his or her hand off of the throttles, and because you're not going to stop. So VR, or the command rotate, is the point at which you actually pitch the nose up and initiate liftoff. And so and V2 is the safety speed at which you climb.
Okay, after it's already gotten underway. Now, I was interested in that article. Again, I could bring it up, but I think you said in there that a side yoke is used a lot of times. And when we think about, I don't know, maybe it's Hollywood or whatever, but we think about them pulling back on the yoke to fly. Is that what happens or not?
It depends on the airplane. There can be a yoke where you physically do pull back on it. And then there can also be a side stick, which is increasingly popular, where you'll actually just pull the stick back and the nose of the airplane will come up on an airliner to somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 or 9 degrees. And at that point, the wings really do begin to produce a lot of lift, and you'll lift off shortly after that.
Next question I had, and again, I don't want to cast any undue suspicions on this particular crew or anything like that, just in general terms. That article that I had up earlier about the passenger talking about the flight, what they said was it was going to be the flight of a lifetime. And that actually can play a role sometimes in these accidents, because it's a flight of a lifetime for the passengers. It might be for the pilots even. I mean, we're going to a big baseball game here, but even if it isn't, they're aware of the fact that it is for their passengers. And sometimes maybe they push it a little bit, this mission creep thing in there, where my question, I guess it's long-winded, but you can make that decision as you're coming down the runway to abort, and you just don't feel right. It doesn't look right. Things just aren't right. Might you continue on when you shouldn't because of the mission?
No, that you're trained. The training is at high speeds. There are very few reasons for you to reject. For example, an engine failure. Okay. If it occurs prior to V1, you stop. If it occurs after V1, you fly. So it's sort of a conditioned response. Is the non-flying pilot, the monitoring pilot, will, if they're monitoring the power, and if they see and you feel the asymmetric thrust, you see an engine that's winding down, you announce engine failure. And if you hear that prior to the V1 call, you stop, period. It's just the way that you fly transport jet airplanes. So the idea of the mission creep, or we've got to do this, it has happened in the past, but it's very rare. And fortunately, that is something that as aviation has matured, you see less and less of. So for the pilots, it's another day at work. It's the trip of a lifetime for the passengers, but for the pilots, it's another day where they're going to move the airplane from Houston to Boston.
As I mentioned at the onset, now you were a commercial airline pilot. You've seen all avenues of this aviation area. I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but is the book, so to speak, a little different for private pilots as opposed to commercial pilots like you were, or is it the same book and to your belief they all adhere to it?
For large airplanes, it's pretty much the same. And for particularly large jet airplanes, everybody's trained to a very high standard, and it's pretty much the same. I was talking with some colleagues of mine yesterday about the high-end corporate airplanes versus the airliners, and the quality of training is actually very, very similar. And that has been my experience as well when I was flying corporate, is that it was very similar to airline style training. The airline training is very extensive, and it's comprehensive, but that's also true for the corporate pilots.
This is a question that I don't know if you've ever gotten this one before, but I've been wanting to ask you this for a while now. With your experience and knowledge, and at this stage of the game, you're flying commercial at times like we all do. When you get on a plane, do you look at things? Do you notice things? Do you have a mental checklist as a passenger that you go through that we all should? And I put it in this context. I'm reminded of this episode. I think you may have been on it. One of these shows about that Hawaii situation where the top of the plane came off, basically, and there was a passenger that got on that plane, and when they were walking in the door, they noticed a crack in the fuselage, and they actually told somebody, they were a friend they were traveling with, about it, I think, if I've got my episodes correct. And if they had reported that, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But as a passenger, should we be looking for certain things? Do you look for things?
The biggest thing is when I get on an airplane, and I was on one to a couple yesterday, is I look for where the emergency exits are. Where is my seat to the nearest emergency exit, both behind me and in front? And the other thing that I look for is to make sure that the overhead bins are fully latched. And as they're closing them, I try to listen to make sure that I hear those latch pins actually go in place, because that's where people really get hurt, is the overhead bins coming up. And on more than one occasion, I've had been on an airplane where an overhead bin has come open, and I've actually gotten up and slammed it shut so that it would not injure someone. So those are the biggest things. And the most important thing is when I'm on the airplane, unless I'm getting up to go to the lavatory, my seatbelt's fastened 100% of the time. That's where people get injured. Airplanes, if you know what the sounds are, they will talk to you. So when you hear motors or pumps running or things, I generally can figure out what those are. And the landing gear going out, the slats and flaps being extended, those are all things that tell me what's going on with the airplane. You can feel sometimes a buffeting, and that's when they've extended the spoilers as they're increasing their rate of descent to meet a crossing restriction for air traffic. So yeah, I'm pretty aware of what the airplane's doing. And even on the cases of a go around, and when you hear the power come up, it's like, okay, we're going to go around, we're not going to land. Those are, I understand what the airplane's doing, but if I saw something that, and I have on one or two occasions seen something, that I'll make sure that either the crew or the flight attendants tell the crew that, hey, there's a panel that's really leaking a lot of fluid here or something like that. But it's their decision, and they'll make the right decision. So I don't really do a whole lot more than most passengers, other than um, I'm pretty regular about making sure I know where the exits are, and I'm actually very conscious of the seatbelt.
Well, in this particular situation down in Houston, now this plane wasn't able to lift off. It, hit a fence and crashed and burned. Some people would say they ran out of runway, but whether or not more runway would have done them any good. But again, we've got to wait for those recorders, I guess, to know. Are there close calls in that type of situation, closer than normal, that happen that passengers are never aware of? And I'm talking about using up more runway slower to take off than what the pilots would have expected, where they might be surprised.
Um, Not really, because we calculate takeoff performance before every takeoff. So, and it's either done in an automated sense. Today, mostly it's automated, but you can do it by hand. I've done many of them. But how much runway do we have? What's the length of the runway? 7,000 feet or whatever. All right. So we have to be able to accelerate to the proper speed to lift off and be able to stop on that 7,000-foot runway. The airplane can only weigh a given amount of weight to do that. So we have to be below that weight that the airplane can accelerate to the decision speed V1 and the liftoff speed VR, rotate, and then climb um, before it encounters any obstacles. So all of those are done. The idea that they ran out of runway is really not accurate, because
Mm.
do you calculate it from how much runway do you have to work with, then that translates into how much the airplane can weigh with the fuel load, passenger load. And on an airplane like this, with it being a corporate airplane with less than 50 seats, the passenger load is going to be pretty light, considering that at one
Yeah.
time it was an airliner. So they should be able to operate in and out of medium length runways without any problem.
Yeah, next question I had was on aviation fuel. And I tell people this all the time. I mean, I grew up in a trucking family around heavy equipment, farm equipment. We grew up on a farm and that type of thing. I know you're familiar with this part of the country as well. But what a lot of people don't realize is the depiction of gasoline, as an example, that you see in Hollywood television shows and movies and stuff, is not real. I mean, if you
Right.
ignite gasoline, man, it is an explosion. I'm telling you, I think it's more explosive than TNT, dynamite, anything like that. You don't put a trail of gasoline on the ground and see it go up very slowly into that just isn't the way that it works. It goes woof. I mean, it's instantaneous. And
Right.
aviation fuel is even a higher octane, a higher grade than gasoline.
No, no.
No.
Jet fuel is highly refined kerosene. So
Oh.
it is not that flammable.
Oh.
You literally, it'll put a match out. I mean, it is cigarette. I've seen people do it. I think they're, crazy, but that, they would flick a cigarette into a canister of kerosene, jet fuel. So no, jet fuel, and one of the reasons it's used is it's not nearly as flammable as gasoline. So when you have a rejected takeoff like this, what ends up happening is the integrity of the wings are compromised, and that opens the bottom of the wing, and it starts venting fuel, because there's tens of thousands of pounds of fuel in the wings of the airplane. So now, if there is a sufficient spark, then you can get the fire to begin to propagate. But one of the reasons that they got out of the airplane so successfully is
Yeah.
that fire propagation is not explosive like gasoline. It moves, and there's a pool of fuel, and there will be fire on top of the fuel, but it's not explosive, and it gives you that 90 seconds usually to be able to get out of the airplane, which they were successful in doing, and I'm really glad to see that. But it speaks well to the flight attendant that was on board, and to the operation of the emergency exits. They said that the slides worked. So the survival factors in this accident is also something that NTSB is going to look at. But these are how airliners and corporate airplanes as well. This is how they're certified: is if there is a need to get out of the airplane, that you can do it within 90 seconds successfully.
Let's talk about that a little bit because that was another question that I had. Now, this is right in your roundhouse. This is aviation safety, fire, smoke. I mean, like a lot of accidents. That's oftentimes the most common reason that people are harmed or even die in accidents is the fire and the smoke inhalation. What about sprinkler systems? I mean, it sounds on planes like they have in buildings. Has that ever been considered? Is it too much weight? It's just not practical. Why don't they do that?
It's a lot of weight because of the amount of water that you'd have to carry, and water weighs about 8 pounds a gallon. But the idea is with a massive fire like this, you're not going to be able to put it out. Look at the fire trucks that show up. They've got
Yeah.
thousands of gallons of water that they can direct, and it may, it's still a fight for them. Initially, when a fire truck shows up at an aircraft accident site, they start knocking the fire away from the passengers, not so much trying to extinguish it, but trying to give the passengers a pathway to get away from the airplane. So once you get one of the large scale fires uh, underway, it takes a pretty good bit to extinguish it. So an onboard system would probably not be effective. That, and particularly for a fuel fed fire. If you're talking about in-flight fires, those are typically either electrical or pneumatic, neither one of which are really well fought by a water mist system. So it really has not proven to be practical, plus the weight considerations.
Now, there are fire extinguishers on board. The reason I ask about that, again, being an old trucker, I mean, people don't realize how many lives are saved out on the interstates, really, by truckers having fire extinguishers in those semis. I mean, they've saved a lot of people's lives with those things. A small fire, or maybe an electrical fire, like you're talking about, in the captains, they have access to fire extinguishers, right?
There's several fire extinguishers on the airplane, and part of the training that the crew goes through is to know the location and the operation of those fire extinguishers. So if there is a fire, and the biggest thing we see in today's world are lithium battery fires, that people bring on lithium batteries and they go into thermal runaway. That's about the leading cause of in-flight fire right now. So now trying to put those lithium battery fires out with a traditional extinguisher is very difficult. So but a typical, either a waste paper fire in the lavatory or an electrical fire, something like that, those are dealt with the onboard fire extinguishers.
Well, we're running out of time here. We got to let the captain go. This is a busy time for him because there's this Houston thing. There's that situation in San Diego. That's another crash that we could have talked about. Maybe we'll get to that at some later date. Now, when you look at this deal in Houston, and I showed that photograph at the beginning from CNN of what that looked at like when they were still trying to put the flames out. Were you surprised? I guess the question is, were those people just lucky, or do you see any factors that could have resulted in them walking away, whereas in another situation they might not have?
I would characterize it this way. This is exactly how the airplanes are certified, is if there is a runway excursion, that you have 90 seconds to get out of the airplane. And this worked. Now, the pictures are post fire. So in the moment that when that airplane came to a stop, there was still a full fuselage around them. There was fire on the outside, but the there was a way for them to be able to get out of the airplane. And so when you see these very um, traumatic pictures, they're post fire. The aluminum fuselage has melted, but at the moment when they're getting out of the fire, that aluminum fuselage was offering them protection between the interior of the airplane and the flames. And as they opened the exits, the slides gave them a pathway. And that's one of the reasons, too, you want to look out of the airplane that you're evacuating to make sure you're not going into a fire, so that you're on the downwind side where the wind is blowing the
Mm,
fire away from the exits. So
sure.
And the flight attendants are trained for this. The pilots are trained for this. So, there's several things that go on, but this reinforces the importance of people listening to the briefings, the safety briefings, when they get on the airplanes.
Well, and I guess that's why I refer to it as a near miracle. Like you say, there's a reason why they survived probably, but it was a near miracle, at least in my mind anyway. Thank God. I think one minor injury, something like that. That's really amazing. That's a trip they'll never forget. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's
Well,
true.
Captain, we got to let you go so that you can get on to your other business here. I always like to give you last word, either on this situation or anything else with aviation safety that's top of mind, things that you're talking to people about around the world here in the past several days.
Everybody's been interested in the MD87, and I think that you've asked some good questions, George. The thing to realize is if you're involved in an emergency like this, if you listen to the flight attendants, follow their commands, be careful, don't inhale smoke, bend over where there's much likely cleaner air, the likelihood is you'll get out of the airplane. The strong likelihood is. So low speed accidents, and this one was that, really maximize your opportunity to survive what it will be a catastrophic event. But you have to keep your head. One of the saddest things I've ever seen was I was working an accident in Los Angeles, and there was a gentleman in the seat who was so frozen by fear that he sat in that seat and died. And he could have gotten out of the airplane, but fear paralyzed him. And I've thought about him over the decades of what a real shame that was, what an unnecessary death it was. So if you're in a situation like this, don't panic, listen to the flight attendants, follow their commands, don't inhale smoke, and get out of the airplane and leave your luggage in the airplane. Don't try to take your luggage with you.
Yeah, there isn't anything in that luggage that you can't buy if you survive. So get the hell out of the plane and follow the instructions that you get. Pay attention, and that's all great advice, man. I'm a huge fan. I really appreciate you coming back on the show to give us this insight into the situation down in Houston with that MD87. Captain Cox, thanks again for coming on another podcast by George Liveline.
Good to see you, George. Thanks for having me on.
Always great. And folks, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you did, please follow Podcast by George. We're on YouTube Live. You can subscribe to us there. Click the little notification bell. And of course, you'll see us on Facebook and iTunes and Spotify and all the places where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.